In this presentation, we're going to try to get some glimpses into Neanderthal behavior. And as you know, initially people thought these were really brutes, dim-witted guys, beetle-browed, bent over, not very bright. In the illustration you're looking at now, you see I've endowed them with a little more humanness and using ochre on their bodies to decorate themselves. There have been found instances where ochre concentrations are found in some of the caves. Don't see why they couldn't have decorated each other with that. Wearing some feathers. There's been a number of sites now, particularly in northern Italy, in the Veneto, and some other sites in Europe that have yielded evidence that they were collecting feathers and eagle talons on a fairly regular basis and perhaps using them to wear the talons around their neck or feathers in their hair or whatever, but using these things perhaps for decoration. So there are some glimpses that they might be a little more human than we've given them credit for. There are shells that show perforations, snail shells that were probably worn around the neck, and concentrations of ochre in some of these shells that suggest that maybe they were keeping ochre in there and using it for body decoration, and that there were some sorts of evidence. There was some sort of evidence from Spain that there were mixing cups, for example, for holding red, yellow, and sparkly black pigments that might have been used as cosmetics, and that there are shells that may have actually contained these, as I said. So it doesn't mean that they're as cognitively advanced as we are, but they certainly weren't simply a bunch of dimwits running around Europe hoping to run into something interesting to eat. There's extensive evidence from the associated stone tools that they're making regular points and scrapers. They're resharpening them. They're using a very particular technique where they take a blank and they flake it all the way around the edge and prepare it a platform and strike off one large flake, much like this one down here in this lower left-hand corner, which is called a Levallois flake. And you see that up above here also. These are Levallois points. And they've done a lot of preparation, a lot of forethought goes into this. It isn't just striking off flakes and maybe being able to use them. They are trying to make a very specific blank to work on and turn into a point. It's called the Levallois technique from its first discovery at a place in France. And the general name for the tools that Neanderthals used and made comes from a site called Le Moustier, and it is called the Mousterian or Middle Paleolithic tradition. And this disc core technique, the Levallois technique, is very specific, and it is something that took a considerable amount of thought to produce. Now, it's interesting to look at the distribution of sites of Neanderthals here and the associations with Mousterian stone tools or lithics. Lithic is meaning stone. And that there are some sites in northern Africa that show Mousterian culture. And there are some in the Middle East, particularly Israel, that show Mousterian techniques. And we know that there are Neanderthal specimens from the Middle East. Now, were they escaping the brutal cold of Europe? At the height of the cold, were they migrating out of there down into more warmer areas? Perhaps. But the point is that there are no Neanderthal fossils found in North Africa. That's important. How did the Mousterian get there? Did they get across the opening to the Mediterranean and didn't leave any bones? Or did humans get into Europe and copy this technique? We don't know. We don't know exactly why they're there. But there are no serious Neanderthal sites in North Africa. So how did Neanderthals behave? What can we say about their behavior? Well, they didn't live in caves, okay? That's, I think, a misconception. They're cavemen, they're often called. They lived in these places that were rock overhangs, that water had eroded out the side of a hill. And those are called abris in French, or a rock overhang. And they would settle in there and live there and sleep there and so on, and get out of the elements and maybe hang skins out over the entrances to these caves. They controlled fire, at least there's strong evidence that they did. Whether or not they could make fire is being questioned again. There are some sites being dug in France that suggest during cold periods, there's no fire. During warmer periods, there is fire. Are they harnessing lightning strikes during those warmer periods? Because during the glacial periods was probably, as you well know, a significant reduction in terms of lightning, which has been pointed out by a colleague of ours. And did the fire go out and they weren't able to remake it? Did they only sort of use fire and not really produce it? It's a big question that's being debated now. We know that they took care of disabled individuals. There are several instances of skulls that have sustained damage, bones that have been broken, bones that have been healed. One example of some of these have no teeth, so they had to be food prepared for them, or they prepared food themselves. We don't know, but it looks like there's some level of compassion for Neanderthals. They probably made clothes out of the hides that they got from animals that they killed, like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos and so on. There are good signs of cannibalism, two sites particularly in Croatia, where it is clear that their bones were being systematically butchered, processed, cooked. There's perhaps to get fat out of them, and the marrow eaten, and so on. So there are good examples. There's lots of cut marks on these bones. If they had ritual magic and art, it was very, very limited. That we have no paintings like we will see in the Upper Paleolithic when Homo sapiens arrives in Europe. But I don't think that they lacked these ritual or art. I think there was some level of it. They hunted. They were not the greatest of hunters. They didn't have spear throwers that we'll find out. Didn't have bows and arrows, for example. They appear to have been close encounter hunters with those points hafted in spears. And yes, they probably had some kind of speech, but it wasn't a symbolically based speech, I don't think, like ours. They have in their genes, because the genes of Neanderthals have been looked at, very important genes like the FOXP2 gene, which plays a role in our speech and language in humans. But there are other genes that also are involved in being able to speak. And those genes have different versions in Neanderthals. So if they had verbalized speech, which I think they did, it was significantly different from ours. And there are regions in their brains that you can see from endocasts that are smaller than in modern humans, particularly Broca's area, which is one of the areas associated with language, and the amygdala in the back, which controls emotions and motivation. Those were much less developed than they are in our brains. So a lot still to understand about their capabilities for speech. Well, what were their origins? Just to remind you of Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain, at the Pit of Bones, where they've got 5,000–6,000 bones and numerous skulls and skeletons. And it looks like these are sort of either proto-Neanderthals or that Neanderthals evolved out of these kinds of humans. Was there some sort of ritual going on here? There was one hand axe that was thrown into this pit that accompanied these burials, these sacrifices perhaps, or these, I mean, they probably threw them in alive. What was all of that about? We may never know the answer, but in terms of anatomy, these were probably the ancestors for Neanderthals. I wanted to point out that in Burgos, which is a town in northern Spain, very close to the Pit of Bones, there's a fabulous museum, which is called the Museum of Human Evolution. And there are changing displays all the time. They had a big display on the work in Tanzania. There are a number of Spanish researchers, expeditions at Olduvai Gorge. There you see, and I hope you recognize, the cranium that Mary Leakey found in 1959 called Zinj, or Olduvai hominid 5, or Australopithecus boisei, and it was about this big. They blew it up that big, and it greets you as you enter the museum. And in the lower right, you see a guide. There are a number of guides at this Museum of Human Evolution who will lead you around and explain the geology, explain the discoveries, explain who these hominins were. And there you see a reconstruction of the some 33 individuals that they dug up. Kind of resembles the team that was working there. And if you're in that part of Europe or traveling there, you ought to plan to go to the museum. It's quite magnificent. I was there not long ago, and they had this incredible exhibit. It's a reconstruction of a Neanderthal. It gives you an idea of that big bulbous nose and massive face and strong brow ridges. And you see it wearing some animal fur skin around it. And you see these eagle's feathers coming out of it, and some painting on the face of pigments like ochre and so on. And this was put together by evidence that was gathered at a site in northern Italy. And now at Gibraltar, there's evidence of the use of feathers and talons, for example. Were they decorating themselves? Were they doing? They were collecting those feathers for something. And most likely, they were using them for decoration. And here you see a feathered Neanderthal. We talked about Gibraltar when we spoke about Neanderthals in 1848. You may remember one of the unrecognized at the time Neanderthals crania was found there. It's now in the Natural History Museum in London, and I believe a good copy, or maybe even the original, is on display. So if you have a chance, you should go have a look at it. And it was found at a place called Forbes Quarry, which is nearby a site that I visited, and there you see this limestone rock in the background near the Rock of Gibraltar. You may have heard of that. And there is a cave just here, which is called Gorham's Cave. There are a whole series of caves along the ocean margin there. This is the Mediterranean lapping up against it and eroding and dissolving these limestone deposits, and there are caves that you can go into. And there's a convenient place to live because you can collect things like mussels and all kinds of shellfish from the ocean. And there's evidence that they were. And in Gorham's Cave, there are a series of Neanderthal layers. And we know they're Neanderthal. They are filled with Mousterian artifacts, the Middle Paleolithic artifacts I briefly spoke of, which are basically a flake-based tradition rather than a blade-based tradition. And during recent excavations, they discovered as they dug down into the Mousterian layers, on the floor, one of the occupation levels, they found these hash marks, these marks that were deliberately made into the floor of the cave. It sort of looks like a hashtag. It's supposed to be quite old. We don't know exactly how old it is, but we know for sure that it's Mousterian, and we know that there were Neanderthals there. Now, if this was a late site, as they have suggested, maybe Neanderthals are picking up some behaviors from Homo sapiens that we'll talk about next week, as we moved into Europe with a much more sophisticated brain and sophisticated culture. But there it is, this recent discovery at Gorham's Cave that we all had the privilege of seeing. They probably weren't the smartest hunters. As I said, they didn't have long-distance weapons. They used close encounter spears. We know that they hunted large game, so you can imagine going up to an elephant, 3 or 4 or 5, 6 of these guys, a woolly mammoth, and killing it, or a rhino, which would have been very dangerous. And they show signs of injuries, healed bone fractures suggesting both in males and females. So males and females might have been hunting here. And these injuries, oddly enough, are the really traumatic bone breakage you get when in rodeo riders, interestingly. And it suggests that they led very physical lives and probably participated in close encounter hunting. So what's the relationship between Neanderthals and sapiens? Neanderthals evolved into humans at one point, we believed. Then we believe they died out without consequence. And now, we didn't interbreed with them, but we now know from genetic work that we have 1 to 4% Neanderthal genes in our bodies. At least non-Africans do. It doesn't seem that Neanderthal genes came back into Africa or migrated into Africa. We picked them up as we moved out into Eurasia. So Europeans and Asians have that. Svante Pääbo, a Swedish geneticist who works in Leipzig, Germany, extracted the first Neanderthal DNA from the original Neanderthal skeleton in 1997. It was just the mitochondrial DNA in those little mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell. But further DNA was extracted from a number of individuals and suggests that there was little diversity, which meant there was probably small population size, and that Neanderthals were distinct. And that modern, and on the basis of our similarities and differences, calculated that we split from Neanderthals about 500,000 years ago, which makes sense in terms of what we know from the pit of bones. In 2014, Pääbo and Ed Green suggested that there is 1 to 4% Neanderthal genes in modern humans. I'm 2.1% Neanderthal. You can find out by going to National Geographic and look at the genomic project. You can ask for the kit, it's mailed to you, you can swab your mouth, where they get the DNA, send it back, and they will tell you how much Neanderthal is in you. Neanderthals and modern humans obviously interbred. So they weren't a complete species, but I'm not sure exactly what that means. But they were certainly able to exchange genes. Neanderthals have that FOXP2 gene, but we don't know about the other genes that are different. So they probably didn't have articulate symbolic speech like us. They had red hair and pale skin. We can tell that from the genes. And Neanderthals may have given us some genes that gave us better immune systems. A number of years ago, a discovery was made in Siberia near the Altai Mountains, about 41,000 years old. And it was a tiny piece of pinky, this little bone right here at the tip of your little finger. And they sent it to Pääbo to see if there was any DNA in it. Turned out there was a complete genome. Not just the mitochondrial, but the nuclear DNA was in there. And it showed that there were significant differences, and the site was known as Denisova, and these early humans were called Denisovans. To this day, we have a toe bone and a couple of molars, and that's all we know. We know more about its genetics than we know about its physical anatomy. The finger bone was destroyed in processing the DNA. So, DNA found at the pit of bones, you may remember, showed that there was a high percentage of Neanderthal gene in it, but there was also Denisovan DNA. We don't know who these guys were, what they look like, but their DNA continues to live in our bodies. I'm 2.6 Denisovan, so my ancestors picked those up before they went to Sweden. And today, their highest frequency is found in Melanesians in southeastern Asia. Neanderthals are infinitely interesting. We know so much about them. This is just here are a few books for you to look at. There's always, it seems that every couple of weeks, something new about Neanderthals is announced. One of our big questions that people are grappling with right now, you'll see more and more, is why did they die out? We didn't kill them off, but we may have displaced them, or we may have swamped their genetic pool so that their genes have just essentially disappeared, and we were the dominant species. We may have pushed them into areas where they were unfamiliar and their hunting wasn't so successful. And they might not have been able to adjust to the climatic warming of Europe that we were. We brought a very sophisticated world with us. And we will be examining that in our next week's presentation. And we will talk again a little bit about Neanderthals, but highlight what it was about being human, Homo sapiens, that allowed our species to survive and see the extinction of Neanderthals.